In the late 1990s, the quiet neighborhoods scattered across northern Florida were places where families felt at ease, doors were left unlocked, and neighbors often came to know each other by name. It was the kind of environment people associated with safety, routine, and predictability. But in 1998, that sense of security was shattered for one community when a violent crime unfolded behind the closed blinds of an unremarkable residential home, one that would eventually lead the state of Florida to carry out one of its most closely followed executions of the decade. At the center of the case was Norman Mearle Grimm, a man with a long and checkered past. Grimm was 38 years old at the time of the crime, living in a modest rental house and working occasional labor jobs. He was known by some in the neighborhood, though only in passing. People described him as quiet and solitary, someone who kept to himself, but sometimes appeared agitated or distant. What many did not know was that Grimm carried a long history of violent offenses, ranging from assault to burglary, and had cycled through the criminal justice system more than once. His victim, Cynthia Campbell, was very different. Cynthia was a hard-working woman in her early 30s who lived just a few steps away from Grimm's home. She was a friendly face in the neighborhood, known for her kindness and calm demeanor. Cynthia worked long hours but always made time to greet neighbors or help someone carry groceries inside. Those who knew her described her as gentle, composed, and grounded, someone who posed no threat to anyone and tried to live her life with dignity and compassion. The year 1998 was a transitional time for Cynthia. She had recently made changes in her personal life, focusing more on herself, her health, and her work. She was settling into stability, something she had always wanted. Her life reflected the quiet confidence of someone who believed better days were ahead. That's what made the discovery of her body so devastating for the community. The crime was not only a shock, it was a violation of the very sense of safety people had always taken for granted. For investigators, the brutality of the case was immediately alarming. Cynthia's body was found inside Grimm's home, wrapped in his bed sheets. She had been sexually assaulted and violently attacked, sustaining blunt force injuries and multiple stab wounds. Although the physical scene told part of the story, the unanswered questions were overwhelming. Why her? Why that night? And why was Grimm, who had prior violent offenses but nothing approaching this level, willing to cross such an irreversible line? In the weeks that followed, the small community that had always felt stable found itself grappling with fear, confusion, and grief. People who once waved to Grimm from across the street now spoke about him only in hushed tones. Some felt guilt that they had never suspected him. Others wondered whether the signs had always been there, unnoticed or ignored. As investigators worked to reconstruct the final hours of Cynthia Campbell's life, a clearer picture began to emerge. The evidence pointed strongly in one direction, and the person responsible for the crime would soon face one of the most consequential legal battles the state had seen in years. This is the story of how a quiet evening turned into a violent tragedy, how a man with a history of aggression crossed the ultimate boundary, and how the state of Florida ultimately responded with the most severe punishment it could impose. It is a case that left lasting scars on everyone involved, and one that would eventually lead to the end of Norman Mearle Grimm's life in the state's execution chamber. On a warm Florida evening in 1998, the events that would culminate in Cynthia Campbell's death began quietly and without warning. Cynthia had returned home after a long day, following the familiar routine she had lived for years. Her home was her sanctuary, a place she trusted, a place where she felt safe. But that night, the routine was interrupted. What investigators would later piece together was a sequence of events that began as Cynthia stepped out of her house and made her way toward her car. Whether her encounter with Grimm was planned or spontaneous remained unclear, but the outcome was devastating. Grimm, who had been drinking that evening and was reportedly agitated, confronted her. What started as an interaction at the edge of their shared property line quickly escalated into violence. According to forensic reconstruction, Grimm forced Cynthia into his home, likely overpowering her in a moment of sudden aggression. The small interior of his residence became the setting for a prolonged and violent assault. Cynthia was raped, beaten, and ultimately stabbed multiple times. 11 stab wounds were documented, along with severe blunt force trauma. The details of the attack were stark, but investigators were careful in how they described them, mindful of the sensitivities involved. During the assault, Cynthia fought back. Evidence later showed signs of resistance, defensive injuries that indicated she struggled against Grimm with everything she had. Her determination to survive was clear, and it was a detail that stood out to investigators throughout the case. After the murder, Grimm attempted to cover up the scene. He wrapped Cynthia's body in his bed sheets, a choice that linked him directly to the crime. He had no explanation for it, no attempt to claim panic or confusion. He simply left her body in the home, alone, while he paced around the property in a state of disarray. What investigators found most telling was not just the physical evidence, but Grimm's behavior after the crime. Instead of fleeing or calling for help, he stayed in the neighborhood, moving in and out of his home, attempting to stage the scene. To some neighbors, he appeared strangely calm. To others, he seemed anxious and agitated, but no one suspected the severity of what had occurred just behind his closed door. The brutality of the crime stood out immediately. There was no element of self-defense, no provocation, no claim of an uncontrolled emotional episode. It was deliberate, forceful, and violent. As investigators later described, it was the kind of attack that indicated not just aggression, but dominance and control. The crime left the community shaken. People who knew Cynthia struggled to understand how such violence could unfold so close to home. Grimm, whose presence had been unremarkable for years, suddenly became the central figure in a nightmare no one had expected. The scene in his home was disturbing, not for graphic reasons, but for what it represented: a complete betrayal of the quiet trust that defined their neighborhood. Cynthia's life had been taken in a place she should have been safe from harm by someone who should have been nothing more than a distant neighbor. As investigators continued to gather evidence, the weight of the crime pressed heavily on everyone involved. Cynthia's family, devastated by the news, demanded justice. The state of Florida, with its strong history of capital punishment, prepared to confront Grimm in a courtroom. But before any trial could proceed, authorities needed to build a case strong enough to withstand any legal challenge. That began with linking Grimm to the crime beyond any doubt, and with ensuring that every piece of evidence was analyzed thoroughly and accurately. The investigation into Cynthia Campbell's murder began within minutes of the discovery of her body. The initial responding officers immediately recognized that the scene was unusual, not just because the victim was found inside the suspect's home, but because the suspect himself remained present in the area. When police entered Grimm's residence, they quickly realized that he could not distance himself from the crime. The body was wrapped in his sheets, lying in a manner that clearly indicated an attempt at concealment. The physical connection between Grimm and the scene was overwhelming, and officers treated the home as an active crime scene from the moment they crossed the threshold. The first major breakthrough in the investigation was the forensic evidence. The sheets used to wrap Cynthia's body came from Grimm's bed. Fibers, hair samples, and trace materials matched his personal belongings. Blood evidence found throughout the home tied directly to the struggle. Additionally, forensic technicians documented multiple fingerprints belonging to both Grimm and Cynthia in areas where she would have had no reason to be under normal circumstances. The forensic unit also confirmed that Cynthia had been raped. DNA samples collected from the scene and from Grimm were compared, and the results left no room for doubt. Grimm's DNA matched the biological evidence recovered from the assault. This alone placed Grimm at the center of the crime, but investigators wanted a stronger, broader case, one that could withstand appeals, motions, and legal scrutiny. Witness reports further reinforced the timeline. Several neighbors reported seeing Grimm acting erratically that evening. One neighbor recalled hearing a brief argument or raised voices coming from the direction of Grimm's home. Others saw him pacing outside his house, sweating heavily and appearing distressed. The autopsy results added a deeper layer to the investigation. The medical examiner confirmed 11 stab wounds and extensive blunt force trauma. The wounds were consistent with a prolonged struggle, supporting investigators' theory that Cynthia fought fiercely for her life. During questioning, Grimm struggled to maintain a consistent account of the events. His explanations were contradictory. at times evasive, at other times incoherent. He claimed he blacked out, that he didn't remember, or that Cynthia had come to his house voluntarily. None of these claims aligned with the evidence, and investigators quickly dismissed them. The turning point came when Grimm stopped cooperating altogether. He refused further interviews and declined to offer a formal confession, leaving investigators to rely solely on physical evidence and witness accounts. Fortunately, the case they had assembled was more than enough. Detectives presented their findings to the state attorney's office, which moved forward with charges of first-degree murder, sexual battery, and aggravated assault. The strength of the evidence left little doubt that Grimm would face the full weight of Florida's capital punishment system. On the day of his arrest, officers arrived with a warrant, and Grimm was taken into custody without resistance. His demeanor was strangely calm, almost as if he understood that the outcome had already been decided. Officers later noted that he showed no signs of remorse and expressed no concern for Cynthia or her family. The investigation moved swiftly from that point forward. Every detail reinforced the conclusion that Grimm acted alone, that the attack was intentional, and that Cynthia had no chance to defend herself against the level of violence she faced. With the evidence secured and the autopsy finalized, the state began preparing for a trial that would ultimately determine whether Grimm would live out his sentence behind bars or face the possibility of execution. The trial of Norman Mearle. Grimm drew significant public attention, not only because of the brutality of the crime, but because of Grimm's history and the overwhelming evidence against him. The courtroom was often filled with Cynthia Campbell's family, local reporters, and community members trying to make sense of how such violence could erupt in their neighborhood. Prosecutors presented a clear and methodical case. They outlined Grimm's history of violent behavior, emphasizing his pattern of aggression and unstable behavior. They introduced the forensic evidence that tied him directly to the crime scene, including DNA analysis, blood samples, and the fibers that matched the bed sheets used to wrap the body. They also highlighted the brutality of the attack. The medical examiner testified about Cynthia's injuries, explaining the nature of the blunt force trauma and the pattern of the stab wounds. While the testimony remained clinical and factual, it conveyed the severity of the violence Grimm inflicted. Prosecutors argued that the crime was deliberate, premeditated, and fueled by aggression, not a sudden loss of control or emotional breaking point. They asserted that Grimm had overpowered Cynthia, sexually assaulted her, and murdered her intentionally, then attempted to conceal the body inside his home. They described the crime as one of the most violent and senseless acts they had encountered. The defense faced an uphill battle from the outset. With the forensic evidence overwhelmingly pointing to Grimm's guilt, they attempted to shift focus to his mental state. They argued that Grimm had a long history of psychological instability, substance abuse, and childhood trauma. The defense presented testimony from mental health professionals who suggested that Grimm suffered from impulse control disorders or undiagnosed psychological conditions. However, these arguments did little to counter the precision and weight of the prosecution's case. The court found that Grimm's actions reflected intentional violence and a clear effort to conceal the crime, not an impaired mental state. His inconsistent statements, lack of remorse, and attempts to stage the scene further weakened any claim of diminished capacity. After weeks of testimony, closing arguments, and jury deliberation, the verdict was delivered: guilty on all charges, including first-degree murder and sexual battery. The courtroom remained tense, with Cynthia's family quietly holding hands as the judge proceeded to the sentencing phase. Given the nature of the crime and Grimm's history of violent offenses, the prosecution sought the death penalty. They argued that the aggravating factors, brutality, sexual assault, and prior criminal behavior, far outweighed any mitigating circumstances presented by the defense. The defense urged the jury to consider Grimm's troubled background and mental health, but the argument fell short. After deliberation, the jury recommended the death penalty, and the judge formally sentenced Norman Mearle Grimm to death. It was a decision that brought a measure of closure to Cynthia's family, though no sentence could undo the pain they carried. For the community, the verdict reaffirmed their belief that justice had been served, but it also reminded them of the fragility of safety, even in the places they trusted most. Following his conviction, Norman Mearle Grimm was transferred to Florida's death row, where he spent the next several years awaiting execution. During this time, something unusual occurred. Grimm chose not to pursue the lengthy appeals that many death row inmates engage in. He waived all final appeals, instructing his attorneys that he did not wish to challenge the sentence. This decision accelerated the legal timeline significantly. While most capital cases take decades to complete, Grimm's case moved swiftly through the final phases. His choice was seen by some as resignation, by others as acceptance. Regardless of motive, it ensured that the execution would proceed without delay. As the execution date approached, Grimm's demeanor reportedly shifted. He became more reserved, spending long hours in silence. Officers who interacted with him described him as calm, cooperative, and distant, neither combative nor emotional. On the day of the execution, Grimm was offered a final meal, though records indicate he made no special request. He remained quiet, speaking minimally to officers. Witnesses described him as composed when he was escorted into the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. When asked if he had any final words, Grimm declined. He made no statement, offered no apology, and expressed no remorse. His silence was notable, especially in contrast to the gravity of the moment. It was the final act of a man who had remained largely removed from the emotional consequences of his actions. As the lethal injection process began, Grimm remained still. Within minutes, the procedure was complete, and at 6:04 p.m., Norman Mearle Grimm was pronounced dead. For Cynthia Campbell's family, the execution marked the end of a long and painful journey through the criminal justice system. While it could never bring Cynthia back or erase the trauma of her violent death, it provided a sense of finality, an acknowledgement that the state had taken the strongest possible action in response to her loss. The community that once knew both Grimm and Cynthia slowly began to move forward, though the memory of the crime lingered for years. The house where the murder took place was eventually vacated, renovated, and resold, but neighbors continued to speak of the incident in quiet tones, reminding newcomers of the tragedy that once occurred there. In the broader context of Florida's criminal justice history, the execution of Norman Mearle Grimm stands as a reminder of how swiftly violence can change lives, how deeply a community can be shaken, and how the legal system confronts acts of extreme brutality. The case is over. The sentence has been carried out. And while justice may have been served in the courtroom and the execution chamber, the deeper loss, the life of Cynthia Campbell, remains the true center of this story.